everybody. Thanks for joining tonight. I'm so excited to do this program. We were trying to figure out something to offer leading up to migration, and everybody loves warblers. Warblers are so great, and I'm so excited for them to get here. Actually, I saw my first today of the year. A bunch of yellow rumps are coming through where I live now here in Ohio. And I thought I knew quite a bit about warblers before I started getting ready for this program. And when I started diving in, I was really surprised at all the stuff that I was able to come up with. So let's go ahead and dive in here. All right, so start with a slide of a male Blackburnian warbler, one of top fan favorites, of course. For most of us, this is a common scene to anyone who's been in the Lake Erie region during migration season. This is the estuary trail right outside of the boardwalk area at McGee Marsh. And like a lot of people, I fell in love with warblers right here. It was about 10 years ago or so. I was up with my mother visiting the area, and we heard that there was some birds going to be at the migratory center, some rehab birds. And I thought, oh, what a cool thing. Like, I like owls and hawks, and that's awesome. And there's some festival going on or something. So we stopped and saw the birds, and I thought that was pretty cool. And we are getting ready to leave, and someone said to me, well, have you been to the boardwalk yet? And I said, what boardwalk? Which is, completely laughable now, as, I've spent days upon days at that boardwalk. And so I went, and it was one of those really spectacular days. It was the type of day where the birds are super low. They're super close. It was a peak migration. And I made it about 100 feet in on this boardwalk in 2 hours. And I didn't know what I was looking at. There's all these birds. They're colorful. They're beautiful. I had no idea what they were. And I had to know more. I had to immediately know more. And clearly that has happened for a lot of people. As you can see, the mass is just packed into this picture. And actually, one of our own here is up front. Brian is right here on the right-hand side. So, okay. So let's start with the basics. There are 54 species in North America. A good number of them come through the eastern United States. Where I live, about 36, 37 species. Most are long-distant migrants, not all of them. They all, for the most part, are brightly colored, with a few exceptions. The typical lifespan is usually 3 to 5 years. Most of the records are 8 to 9 years. The oldest is actually an 11-month-old northern water thrush. That is the oldest ever recorded due to some banding data. They were able to collect that. The smallest warbler is Lucy's warbler, averages about 4.2 inches in length, and ovenbird is our largest, coming in right under 6 inches. And this is fun, a group of warblers is called a bouquet, a confusion, a fall, or a wrench. Let's talk about names for a little bit. I don't know if there's a bigger group of birds that has such a weird collection of names that has nothing to do with the species at all. We've got Cape May warbler, which was discovered in Cape May and then not seen again in Cape May for over 100 years. So it's kind of a poor representation. And funny enough, Alexander Wilson, an ornithologist, he's kind of responsible for all of these issues because he kept naming things where he found them. Same with a magnolia warbler. He found that bird in a magnolia tree and ended up naming it after a tree that it doesn't typically feed in or nest in or anything. It just happened to show up. You've got Tennessee warbler, which nests about 600 miles north of Tennessee and only briefly passes through as a migrant. Connecticut warbler, which is a very rare migrant to that state. It doesn't breed there. It rarely migrates through. It just so happened that they collected a bird in that location. Same rings true with Nashville warbler. They came through on migration and That's the name, even though that bird spends most of its time in the boreal forest or in the tropics. And then you've got worm-eating warbler, which actually eats predominantly caterpillars, but they used to call caterpillars worms, which is where it gets its name from. And I'm going to let everyone just pause on this slide for a minute. Everyone knows, I think for the most part, that blackpoll warbler is a migration champion. It has one of the longest known migrations, comes in only behind, I think, Arctic tern. And yearly, it makes a 25,000-mile round trip, 12,500 miles one way, all the way from Alaska all the way down to South America. This includes a 72-hour nonstop flight over the ocean. And it is mind-boggling that something this size can do this. I mean, it weighs 12 grams. It's 3 pennies. Like, it's insanity. And that's double their body weight. So they've doubled their body weight in a matter of 7 to 10 days. So think about that. Think about whatever your weight is and go ahead and subtract that 20 from, the COVID months. Don't hold yourself accountable like I'm not. And think about the effort it would take to double your own body weight in a week and a half. Absolutely incredible. So what an amazing bird. And, just because blackpoll's amazing doesn't mean the others aren't too. Many of these birds are nesting way up in the boreal forests in Canada, and they're traveling all the way down to South America as well. So they might not go quite as far, but it's still an incredible feat. A lot of these birds are traversing the Gulf of Mexico, flying nonstop. They're nesting so far north, and then they're spending most of their time in the Greater Antilles and Central America and down in South America. So, you think about us as humans and how poorly equipped we are to even think about competing with this sort of physical activity. Vocalizations. So vocalizations are a huge, 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 huge time commitment during the breeding season. 60% of their day is spent on singing, and this is the males, mind you, which is a huge amount. I mean, you think about all the time they need to eat, sleep, preen, but still singing is the predominant activity that they're taking part in. I kind of averaged it out with most of the species, and it varies wildly between the species, but it's about an average of 225 times an hour that they are singing their song. And a black-throated green warbler had actually been recorded singing 466 times an hour. And they have kind of a long song, so that's an incredible amount of singing. A lot of studies have shown that the birds are kind of born with a rough draft of their song. They have an innate sense of kind of the notes that they should be singing, but it's fine-tuned later from parents, neighbors, things like that. They learn to mimic some songs, and the complexity a lot of times is learned from, however many individuals that they're exposed to. And something that's kind of not really known, that both males and females sing. A lot of times we don't hear females singing. It happens a lot more over on the wintering grounds than it does here. And some hasn't been recorded, but there's no reason to believe that if a handful of species do it, that they probably all don't. They all do it. So they do sing for very different reasons. Males sing predominantly to establish territory and to get a mate. And also they have specialized songs to drive other males out of their territories. Females typically use their song to call the males, solicit food. There has been some recordings of light singing at nests, which seems to indicate that they want the males to bring food to the young. But it's definitely interesting to think of females singing. And I've actually seen it one time. I had a Kirtland's warbler female singing one time, and it was kind of a shortened song. It was very unusual. I even have pictures of that bird because I was surprised to see a female singing. Singing activity is mostly in the mornings, and with some species again in the evening. Almost all of them stop about high noon. They take a break from the singing And they also stop singing once a pair bond is formed, but usually pick it back up again in a more territorial way. The type of songs they sing varies greatly in length, duration, complexity, depending on the purpose, the time of year, um, a number of factors. So they have shortened songs, they have their full complex song, they have a lot of call notes and different chip notes. So it's a very complex thing that they're able to do. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is hooded warblers actually use long-term memory to identify the songs of their neighbors. So when they come back the next year, if they hear the same males, they don't worry about going over and try to fight them for territory. They know they're already there, they're established, and now they don't have to waste the energy of fighting with them for territories. So pretty interesting stuff there. Plumage is interesting with warblers. You have people talk about confusing fall warblers, but really it's only a handful of warblers that actually even change in the fall. It kind of a lot of times looks like they've just been desaturated. And they're really, really desaturated on something like the black-poll warbler or the bay-breasted warbler, which goes to almost no color whatsoever. But a lot of them maintain the same look all year. You've got ovenbird, the water thrushes, um, yellow-throated warbler, none of those change. In addition to that, some of the species show dimorphism and some don't. So you've got the wildly different bird like black-throated blue that looks incredibly different, but pine warbler looks about the same. Most of the birds do complete a full molt before the end of the breeding season. So that's a lot of energy usage. You got to think they're breeding, they're traveling, then they're breeding and they're raising young and they're feeding the young along with themselves. And then they have to use the energy to do a full molt before heading back south. And that's really mind-boggling that they're able to do all of this in such a short period of time, which is probably one of the reasons that it takes 2 years for the olive warbler to even get to its adult plumage. American redstart also can kind of have some late bloomers when it comes to plumage and getting to that point. A lot of times the males, redstart, if they're not in their full plumage, they'll try to solicit females, and it works sometimes, but that plumage is really important in mate selection. The more brightly colored they are, the more full and good their plumage is and good condition means that they're probably more likely to get not only a better nesting spot, but an easier time finding a mate. A lot of the warblers have spots on their tail feathers. So when they fan them, you can see that on a number of species, American redstart, hooded warbler, magnolia warbler, and it's thought that this helps with hunting insects. As they flash that tail, it scares insects up and they're able to find them and eat them. So studies were done on hooded warbler that on birds that did not have those white spots that were darkened, they were actually a lot less successful hunting than the birds with the white spots. So plumage is a multi-purpose mechanism. You know, not only is it nice to look at, but it actually aids them in some of their hunting. I was surprised to learn about the preening. Shorebirds take a ton of time preening, like 30% of their day, and I would think most birds would be the same, but it's actually kind of put on the back burner when it's breeding season. The warblers only spend about 5 to 10% of their time caring for their feathers, probably because they go into a full molt anyways right before they leave. So it's not a huge issue to try and take care of all those feathers that they're going to mold out anyways. They do a lot more than take baths. They will also, in dry areas, use leaf bathing, which is where they would take drops of dew off leaves and rub themselves against the leaves and collect that moisture and use that to kind of bathe, because not everywhere. You look at some of the western species like Lucy's warbler, lives in a scrubby desert lowland habitat, not a lot of access to water, so they have to get creative. A lot of them engage in a scratching to try and get those feathers nice and clean. I was really fascinated with what warblers eat. I predominantly think of warblers as eating insects, which they do. They are predominantly insectivores and eat a variety of different insects, but they also eat a lot of other things as well. Especially over winter, a lot of birds end up eating fruit, berries, sap, nectar, plant buds. Some of the water thrushes will eat small fish and aquatic invertebrates. And pine warbler is the only warbler that eats a diet that's mostly seeds. And that's very unusual. They have a different mechanism to digest their food than the other birds because they're mostly a seed eating bird. And weirdly enough, there are a handful of cases of Swainson's warbler eating small lizards, which I thought was pretty interesting. So after they leave us and we see them for migration, they head north to their breeding grounds. It's pretty incredible that the site fidelity, so the place that they're returning to, is a lot of times incredibly high, almost 100%. So if that bird nested in that place last year, they're going to come back to the exact same spot. And it's really amazing that they're able to remember that information. Of course, males are very territorial. There's a lot of fighting when things are first established. They will use their bills and do bill clasps and pecking and cause a lot of ruckus trying to get males out of their territory. A lot of birds actually share locations though. So you look at the boreal forest and each of the birds nest in a different location. So you've got, ovenbird on the ground, you've got some of the other birds in the canopy like bay-breasted, and then way up high you've got things like black burnian that nest much, much higher than all the rest. So they're all using the same area, but they're making use of each section of the forest so they can kind of share resources without overlapping too much. For example, in southern Ohio, worm-eating warblers will use very steep slopes. Ovenbirds will use a mid-grade slope, and the lowlands are almost exclusively used by Louisiana water thrush and Kentucky warbler. So they kind of share the same area without getting in each other's way too much. There are very specialized habitats for a lot of these though, which is why habitat is, and deforestation and things like that are of such high concern. You have cerulean warbler, which needs a very mature forest with openings. You have golden wing warbler, which needs a successional area that's very scrubby, and they won't nest anywhere else. Of course, Kirtland's warbler only nests in jack pine forests, and they only nest in trees ranging from about 5 to 12 feet. When they reach that 10, 12 foot mark, they quit using them and they have to have new areas. So it's a very specialized location for a lot of these. And with Kirtland warblers, they actually nest in kind of a colony situation where they all kind of use the same area and they kind of stay in that place. They come back to that place together and they all kind of leave together, forage together after breeding season's over. The only warbler that is not known to have all of its members in the same area is hooded warbler. Males will use a mature forest area, and females will stay completely in another area in like a lower, scrubby, dense vegetation area. And the male will sing and feed in his area and then visit the female to help feed young and go back to his area, and she'll stay in her own area. So that's kind of an unusual situation there. So mate selection is a pretty complicated process. Typically, most of the warblers are monogamous, and sometimes for multiple years. So it's been recorded that if a pair is successfully bred together the following year, they may try it again. But there are exceptions. Hooded warbler in particular really likes to have some fun. And many times the females will go off and solicit a number of additional males. The males will solicit additional females. And they're kind of the worst of the bunch when it comes to monogamy. But the others aren't real great either on this list. So while most are fairly monogamous, there are exceptions. The pairings do happen very quickly. The males spend a lot of time trying to impress the female as soon as she arrives. They've already been on the breeding grounds for a while, and as soon as they arrive, they're singing, calling, and they're pairing up pretty quickly. Sometimes the males engage in some flight displays, almost like shorebirds do. There's a number of different flights that they do. Blackburnian probably does the most elaborate, where they do these big aerial loops through the forest, and they kind of slowly wind downwards and drop lower, and then they can do an exaggerated, what's called a moth flight, where they do kind of a slow flapping motion at the end. It's kind of interesting an interesting display. Females a lot of times will pick their mate based on their condition and the complexity of their song. So, a more experienced male probably has a better shot because he has a more complex song. And while most copulation is done on the breeding grounds, there are some records of it happening during migration, and there's not a lot of information as to why. But occasionally they get females who are already pregnant on their way north, which is pretty crazy. The pair bond is really intense for a very short period of time. Many times the male will show the female some of the sites to choose for nesting. In some of the species, sometimes the female picks all by herself. She typically does most of the nest building on her own, but occasionally the males will help. Both are very protective of their nest site and will defend it from predators and other birds. Once the nesting begins and the eggs are laid, the male sometimes feeds the female, depending on the species, but a lot of times she's just kind of on her own. They don't typically associate with any other birds during this time, except for a few that look for other mates or do some extra breedings outside of their first one. But as soon as the young are fledged, the pair bond is done and they go their separate ways. Sometimes that happens as soon as the babies are on the ground. Some go with mom, some go with dad, and that's the end. Others kind of form a loose family group and hang around until migration. Here's a yellow warbler pulling some spider webs. This was taken on the McGee Boardwalk, actually, and that's a great place if you live in the area or you visit for Biggest Week to see some nesting behavior up close, because they nest right next to the boardwalk, so it's a lot of fun. Primarily, it is done by the female. Males do occasionally help build the nest. Louisiana warbler is about the only one that splits the work 50-50. Some nests are done in a very short period of time, in just a couple days. Others are pretty elaborate, and they take upwards of 9 or 10 days. They followed one female black-throated green, and it took 143 trips day one. And this is just mom, by the way. This is just the female doing these. 143 trips day one, 59 trips on day two, 7 trips on day 3, and 6 trips on day 4. They do use a variety of materials: spider webs, lichens, grasses, feathers, mosses. There's even been some records of porcupine quills being used, which seems counterproductive and seems like a bad thing to put in your nest. Prothonotary warblers and lucies are the only birds to nest in cavities. And while most nests are built off the ground, there are a handful that nest on the ground. So ovenbird, black and white, worm-eating, Wilsons, the water thrushes, golden-winged nest just off the ground, but very close to the ground. Redface a lot of times nest right up against trees, and Kirtland warblers nest almost on the ground, just off of it. And actually, Brian recently told me a story that he was in southern Ohio and found a black and white warbler nest, and he saw where it was, and he saw the bird on it, and he had looked away and looked back, and the bird had flown off, but he couldn't find the nest. He looked and he knew exactly where it was, and he looked and looked and looked. And what she had done is actually take a leaf and pull it over the top of the eggs when she left to conceal them. So they go to some pretty elaborate things to protect these nests, which is really, really cool. Most birds lay 2 to 6 eggs. I think the average is probably 4 to 5 for most species. Although sometimes when there's a big spruce budworm outbreak up north, some of those birds may lay bigger clutches. Bay-breasted, Cape May, Tennessee have all been known to do it, and they can get upwards of 9 or 10 eggs in a clutch to take advantage of the bounty of food that happens during these budworm outbreaks. Most of the incubation is about 10 to 13 days, and it's almost always done by the females. There are a handful of reports of Kirtland warbler and northern parula sitting on the nest, the males sitting on the nest. Almost always, though, the female is exclusively responsible for that task. Eggs are a lot of different colors. I've only personally been able to see a yellow warbler nest, which is what is in the picture here, but they come in a variety of shades. So in almost all are mottled, so you get like a pink shade, some purple, blue, brown, gray, pretty much any color you can think of depending on the species. There's a big variation on what the color is. Almost always, if a nest fails, there's a second attempt made. The exceptions, sometimes bay-breasted, they're such early fall migrants that sometimes if their nest fails, they just head out. There are a handful of birds that double clutch. Black-throated blue is a known one, yellow-throated, and I don't have this listed, but I actually just recently found out pine warbler as well, probably due to their proximity to the southern states and the favorable weather. Northern parula and prothonotary warbler will double clutch as well. Some egg dumping does occur. Prothonotary warblers actually end up raising about a third of the chicks in their nest that don't belong to them. So if a female prothonotary will go lay an egg in another prothonotary nest, and then that chick is raised by a different mom. I'm not sure why they do that. I mean, I guess when my kids were babies and toddlers, it was nice to have a break. So maybe that was part of their thinking, but pretty interesting that a third of them are raised by a mom that's not their own. Brown-headed cowbird is a major nest parasite for all species. It's not quite so bad in the very northern boreal species, as cowbird's range doesn't quite go that far, but they do get into some of the southern ranges of the boreal breeders. But it is a major issue. It was actually one of the reasons that Kirtland's warbler was on the endangered species list, which luckily it's been delisted because they took measures to trap and get rid of the cowbirds in the area, which helped bring that species back. If anyone's unfamiliar, cowbirds are parasitic nesters, so they will dump their egg into a warbler nest, and when the baby hatches, it's significantly larger than the other warbler babies, so it outcompetes them for food, and a lot of times those other babies end up perishing, and then they get all of the resources, and the warblers will continue to feed them as if they're their own all the way through fledgling, and then they ultimately leave and join up with other cowbirds. Protecting the nest. Parents are actually pretty aggressive when it comes to this. For being such small birds, they really do some fighting to keep predators away from their babies. They'll scold them, dive bomb, chase them off. Golden wing warblers have actually been observed to take food to a location nearby their nest. They nest at the base of plants that have a tall stem. So they'll go to another stem and walk down the stem to the bottom of where this invisible, non-existent nest is to decoy predators away from their actual nest location. A lot of times the females will sit very tight on the nest. Worm-eating warbler, the only way to get her off the nest is to actually touch her. She'll sit tight all the way up into that point. She's willing to wait it out to protect her eggs or her babies. I mean, that's a dedicated mom right there. Most of us are familiar with killdeer doing a broken wing display to try and get predators or any threat away from their nest, but warblers actually do the same thing. They will, both males and females will show a broken wing display or kind of clumsily fall out of a tree and hop around almost like a fledgling, and then when they draw the predator away, they'll fly off. So they do a number of things to try and keep their eggs safe. Baby warblers. I had a really funny, hilarious pic of a baby common yellowthroat and had crazy like Bernie Sanders hair. And I unfortunately lost the picture when my hard drive failed last year. Um, but that's the only baby warbler besides yellow warblers that I've ever seen. Really cool to watch. They are usually fed by both parents. Typically, the female ends up doing more of this. The brooding is only done by females. There are no records of males ever sitting on the young to keep them warm at all. It's exclusively mom. Feeding, of course, increases a lot as they grow. So on day one, typically 15, 16 trips a day, all the way up to 67 trips a day by the time they're older and getting ready to fledge. The average fledgling time is about 8 to 12 days, depending on the species, which is crazy, right? Like they're only sitting on these eggs for about 8 to 10 days. And in another 8 to 10 days, these birds are out and flying, some of them. I mean, not so long after. I mean, the turnaround is just incredible how quick all this occurs. There's been records of worm-eating warblers leaving the nest after 5 days and flying at 8 or 9 days. I mean, it's just the amount of time it takes for them to be self-sufficient is really, really low. It's really amazing. Parents typically do continue feeding the young for several weeks after fledging, and sometimes hang out in a loose family group, or the fledgling themselves, once they can fly, kind of hang together as like a teenage group until they get ready for fall migration. With a few exceptions, males overall do a pretty poor job raising young. Females do most of the work. One documented case showed that a black-throated green female delivered 245 meals to her babies before they fledged, and the male delivered 11 on the very last day, which is a pretty sad joint attempt to raise these kids. There's also been some documented where the males were trying to feed fledglings as if they were newborns, like he didn't have any clue what he was doing, and trying to take the food and put it way back in the back of the bird's throat. And the bird's like, "What are you doing, Dad? Like, that's not how I eat." So they try, but the males are not a huge part of the successfulness of young warblers. A lot of predators for not just the parents, but the eggs and the young. I mean, pretty much anything you can think of. Cats, of course, feral cats are a huge issue for all migratory birds, but snakes, squirrels, skunks, both blue and gray jay, or Canada jay, I guess, will eat a lot of fledglings. Any small mammals, mice, mink. And weirdly enough, I recently found an account of a Chuck's-Will's widow, which is another bird. It's a nightjar that eats mostly bugs, but they found a Cape May warbler in the stomach of a Chuck-Will's widow, which is just mind-blowing that they're able to eat. I mean, they're out at dark. These birds are migrating at dark, and I guess it was an easy snack. Fall migration is not nearly as rushed as spring. Birds take a lot less time. There's not such a big hurry. And most do go ahead and molt into that winter plumage before they travel, if they have a winter plumage to change into. This is a black-poll warbler, which you can see looks incredibly different from the spring version, but they're still hanging on to those orange legs. Most of the time, fledglings leave after the parents, but some travel together. So black-throated blues have been known to travel as a family group down, and then the first-year birds actually fly ahead of the parents, but once they reach the wintering grounds, when the more experienced birds arrive, they get kicked out anyways. So they have to find their new wintering ground spots after their parents come along and take their spots back. A number of first-year birds take a really different route down south than their parents. A lot of the experienced birds fly directly down the middle of the U.S. or one of the flyways that goes south, like out west. But a lot of times the young actually follow the coastline on their first trip down. And when they reach the tropics, a lot of times they rejoin the same mixed flock, any of the birds that associate with, tanagers down there, or any of the mixed flocks in the tropics. They'll join that exact same group again when they get back to the tropics. Here's a Tennessee warbler eating some fruit down in Costa Rica. I have to say, when I recently was in Costa Rica, and it was really, really awesome to see the warblers down there. There's a handful of species that I got to see, and it was just so exciting. Like, oh, you guys made it! Like, to see it in full circle. I've seen them in the spring, and who knows, I could be looking at the same bird that I had seen 4 months prior, and now it's, hanging out eating papaya in the tropics. But I always wondered, like, why do they even leave? Like, Costa Rica is incredible. All the tropics are incredible. Why do they even bother taking this extremely difficult and dangerous journey? It's because the amount of resources can only sustain them for a short time down there. They have to leave, or all of the birds in the area would suffer. There's not enough food to go around 12 months out of the year. There's also a lot more predators down there. There's a lot more snakes. There's a lot more rodents. There's a lot more things that would eat their young. Food scarcity is probably the biggest driving force, though. When they move north and take advantage of all of the insects and the bounties of the north that happen in the spring and summer, it gives the tropics a time to replenish their resources, and then they can return and use those when they come back. I did recently read an article that most birds, or the birds that they've studied, actually have what's called a migration gene. And this is a new study, so there's not a lot of information out there about it yet. But these birds are pre-programmed with a mapping system on how to get to where they're going, which is just really cool stuff. When they do get to where they're going, this is a mourning warbler that was taken in Costa Rica. The site fidelity is lower than the breeding grounds. Some of them return to the same location, but it's not as specific as the breeding grounds. As long as there's food and resources, they're pretty happy to be in the area. They do associate with feeding flocks and will join in scolding and mobbing if they find an owl. Not all birds leave the US, though. A handful actually stay year-round. A majority of population of palm, yellow-throated, and yellow-rumped all just migrate down to Florida or Texas, in that area, and stay over winter in some of the southern states. Pine warblers, a good portion of them stay as well. And most of them don't sing on the breeding grounds, but like I said, if you're going to hear females singing, that's probably more likely of a place than you would up here during the breeding season. So a few interesting tidbits that I wasn't able to cover in the general stuff, because it's amazing. We have all these warblers, they're in the same family group, but they're wildly different. While a lot of them stick to a certain norm, there's always some exceptions. So yellow warbler is the only warbler to be able to identify a cowbird egg. Most of the birds don't notice. There has been research done that if a cowbird call is played with a yellow warbler, they freak out. They try to find the bird. They've attacked the recorder. They know that that's an issue. And as soon as they find that a cowbird egg has been laid in their nest, they start over. They build another nest right on top of the cowbird egg, and will keep doing so if the cowbird comes back. The highest recorded, there was a 5-level high nest. Finally, they got to the point where the cowbird didn't lay anymore, and 5 levels high, the yellow warbler was able to hatch their own eggs. The females can be pretty tough. They can be rather territorial as well, and will chase other females off. And like I said earlier, they will sit on their nests and attack predators. So, the males aren't the only ones that are somewhat aggressive. Red-faced warbler males, for whatever reason, and the reason's not known, is they occasionally will build themselves their own nest. And they'll build it in close proximity to the main nest. And they do spend some time sitting in it. It's usually rather poorly constructed, but no one really knows the purpose that it serves, except he likes to go hang out there sometimes. So my only thought is that maybe he needs time away from the wife and kids and created a little man cave for himself. Connecticut warbler is the least understood. The first nest was not even discovered till 1883, and there's actually been one nest study ever completed back in 1961. They're such difficult birds to find. They're skulkers, they live in extremely dense habitats, they're really far north, so they are one of the least understood birds. John J. Audubon actually observed them doing a behavior that's not been seen since, and they were swooping down like barn swallows and picking spiders off water. So, if you're ever in an area where there's Connecticut warblers, pay attention. Maybe you'll be the second person to document such a thing. And also, they're always associated with McGillivrays or more, in the eastern US, mourning warblers, but they're actually not closely related at all. Townsend's warblers almost exclusively overwinter in Mexico and feed on these sugary excretions known as honeydew from insects that are scaling bark off trees. And they actually will set up territories that they will defend, just like breeding season, but for a food source. So they will set up a territory around this food source and defend it so they can get to this honeydew sugar in Mexico. I like to think of northern water thrushes snuggling, and that's apparently what they do on the wintering grounds. They sometimes roost communally. So groups of them will roost together in a tree in large numbers, which I thought was pretty cool. Both worm-eating warbler and olive warbler are not closely related to any of the other warblers, and actually olive warbler isn't even in the same family group. They're not a warbler at all. They're in their own genus, but they've kind of been lumped with the rest of the warblers. I gave the warbler dads a hard time talking about the care of the young, but Canada warblers actually have been documented to do a lot more of the work than the female as far as caring for the young. So at least there's a couple diligent warbler dads out there. I don't know if anyone's heard of Bergman's rule. Bergman's rule states that the further north you go from the equator, the larger that the birds get. A lot of that is because they need to be more hardy to survive the colder temperatures. But Tennessee warbler actually breaks that rule. The further north that those birds nest, the smaller the bird is. So the larger species are actually southern and the smaller ones are actually northern. Yellow-rumped warblers have adapted to digest the waxes and bayberries, and they will overwinter in Canada sometimes. A lot of times you can see yellow-rumped warblers year-round in the US. A lot of times they end up on Christmas CBCs because they're able to digest these special berries. Cape May warblers have a totally different tongue than all the other warblers. It is curled and semitubular because they spend a lot of time drinking nectar. And if you're ever at McGee when these, whatever these flowers are blooming, you'll find a lot of Cape May warblers in there drinking nectar. This is a female black-throated blue warbler. And for quite some time, this actually was thought to be a different species because it looks so different from the male, and originally was named the pine swamp warbler. And after years of study, they figured out that this actually is just the female black-throated blue, but it's sometimes referred to as Audubon's extra warbler. Kentucky warbler, unlike most, has one song. The song that they start off with is the only variation they can do. They don't mimic other birds. They don't replicate or add to their complexity. The song that they have is the song that they have, and that's it. They can, however, match the pitch of a neighbor. So if the neighbor's song is higher or lower, they can match their song to that pitch, but they don't change it at all. Black and white warblers, a lot of times in the early days were known as black and white creeping warblers, and many people have probably seen they climb along tree trunks much like a nuthatch or brown creeper. And the reason they're able to do this is they have extra long hind toes or a claw, and they have much heavier legs than all of the other warblers, which allows them to be able to hang on to the tree bark. This has got to be one of the coolest stories I found during this whole time of researching. Hope everyone enjoys my little editing job here. Oops, sorry. I added a spy hat and secret agent glasses to this prothonotary warbler. A prothonotary warbler actually helped indict a Cold War spy because there was a man, his name was, it was Chambers, And he had said, hey, yes, I did espionage against the US. And this other guy did too. His name's Alger Hiss, and he did espionage as well. And they said, well, tell us about him. Like, tell us something that only you would know. And he said, well, he found a prothonotary warbler by the Potomac. He was a amateur ornithologist and a big birder, and he was very excited to have found this prothonotary warbler. So later on cross-examination, they brought in this Alger Hiss guy, and he said, oh no, I don't know this other guy. I'm not a spy. And they said, well, okay, we need to learn more about your life, so tell us about your hobbies. And he brought up the fact that he had seen a prothonotary warbler, therefore proving that he was lying, and he did know this other guy, because if he didn't know him, how would this guy know he had seen a prothonotary warbler? So he actually ended up getting arrested for espionage, all because he went birding and found a prothonotary warbler. So this has been a fun program to learn about. I've spent hours and hours and hours reading and researching. I've used, as far as my sources, I have used Audubon. I've used the Birds of North America, Cornell's Birds of the World for my information. Most of us really love and care about warblers. They are on the decline. So, you know, loss of habitat's huge. Human interference is a big deal. Like golden-winged warblers will abandon their nests, even if they've laid half their eggs, if they're disturbed. Hybrids are an issue. So what can you do? I mean, if you love warblers, some things that you can think about: only buy coffee that's shade grown. That's an important thing for a lot of different birds. It gives them a place to overwinter at, and they're not losing habitat because of it. Do not disturb nesting birds. You find a bird on a nest, leave. Don't do playback. Like that's not good for the birds at all. Be an advocate in your local community for habitat protection or restoration. And ecotourism. Visit the tropics. Let people know down there how important these birds are, how much money it can bring to their economy, and make sure that those people are protecting them as well. We do have a few upcoming warbler tours if you are interested in seeing more in person. We've got a couple photo trips running in the next couple months, and we have a few spots left on our birding trip that runs through the Lake Erie region. So, as always, check out our site for more info, and those are the sources. I'm going to try to bring my video back. Hopefully my computer doesn't shut down here.
All right, great talk, Jamie. If we have any questions, we can put those through in the chat. Jamie will take a few questions if anyone has any. You're getting compliments instead of questions, Jamie.
Oh,
so check the chat.
Thanks, Gail. It's good to see you, by the way. And I actually left some information out in the essence of time, so there is wildly cool information out there about these birds.
Someone asked if there is a checklist of all the warblers anywhere that you know of.
One that can probably be pulled off of eBird and just change just to warblers. We can probably put something together for you. If you send us your email, we can get that sent out to you.
And then someone asked about what our website is. Our website is saberwingnaturetours.com. Any other questions? What is your favorite warbler and why? Gail wants to know, Jamie.
Oh, Gail. Oh my. That is a tough, boy, that's a tough choice.
When she says you can only pick one.
Oh, that's not fair. Favorite warbler and why? Oh, crap. You know, I think actually, if I was forced to choose, gun to my head, it's probably a fairly unpopular opinion, but I really like yellow-rumped warbler. They're totally underrated. They're the first birds back, the last to leave, so I get to enjoy them the longest. And if they were rare, everyone would go crazy over those birds. So I'm not saying that's my favorite word. I'm not committing to that, but if I'm forced to choose right here and now, I guess I'll go with that one.
Very good. So Brian Cunningham asks, what is one of your favorite Warbler memories?
Um, Probably absolutely that very first day ever realizing warblers existed. Like I've seen a lot of warblers since then, and that there's nothing like that day. I don't know if there's ever been a day that good. I'm sure I've built it up in my mind, but it was a pretty spectacular event, and it really led me on the path to everything that I do now. So for better or worse, that slippery slope started right then.
It's tough not to fall down that slope once you
Oh,
hit the boardwalk once.
oh yeah, it was straight on down.
Someone was asking about yellow warblers nesting. He says they're nesting in Jamaica Bay, New York, and was asking if it's typical for them to nest this far south.
Yeah, so I'm in Ohio. Yellow warblers are probably one of the species that are most widespread, and you can probably find them in most states, actually. There's actually variations as well, all the way down the tropics that are still actually yellow warbler, but they have like a chestnut cap or a red head, and they're still the same genetic species, but they're incredibly widespread. They nest all over the US.
Let's see, someone asked what got you started in birding, but I'm guessing that was your first day that you've told about.
That was actually nesting eastern bluebirds in my yard
Okay.
was the start, and then the nail in the coffin was that big warbler day.
Very good. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions come through. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We're really happy to have you here. We've got one more program coming up on our schedule next Wednesday night. Edison Buenano, our guide that we work with in Ecuador, will be joining us again to talk about southern Ecuador and all the great birding locations down in southern Ecuador. So you can register on Eventbrite again for that. So check that out. We'd love to have you again next week. Hope everyone gets to enjoying migration out there. It's been a lot of fun seeing new birds come in. So we hope you're getting out birding and enjoying. There was one more question we can go ahead and answer real quick. There was a question about were the warblers affected by the extreme cold in Texas recently?
So a lot of the species probably weren't here yet. I'm sure there was a lot of birds that were affected, and I saw a lot of posts of some of the southern species that didn't fare so well, unfortunately. But even in Texas, migration doesn't really start until about now. There's some stuff moving through, and probably some in March, but luckily that big amount of cold didn't probably impact most of the species. They were still in the tropics or further south.
Yeah. All right, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again on another Saber Wing program. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Hope everybody learned something.